Welcome to this session of Insights on Demand and my presentation on best learning moments in mobile language learning. I'm Agnes Kukulska-Hulme, Professor of Learning Technology and Communication in the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University in the UK, where I lead the Learning Futures program of research and innovation. We've been doing research on mobile learning for a long time, and although we haven't used the concept of best learning moments as such, much of our focus has been on how to improve the learning experience for the learners. We've been interested in how informal learning that goes on in various environments, at home, in the city, in classes, around educational institutions, how the learning that takes place in all those different environments can be enhanced and can be connected, and how the learners make their choices known to us. Because that kind of learning is very much learner driven. So that's the kind of focus for this presentation, a focus on learners, their preferences, and their best learning moments, and the designs that we should produce for pedagogical interventions, for applications for the next generation of mobile language learning. Technologies change, but what we're interested in are the innovations that can be introduced and the lasting benefit that they bring. So when we think back a few decades, the technologies were not what they are today. They were more clunky, less portable, less easy to use, but things have improved a lot. And now we see new technologies emerging. The smartwatches came along. Now we have the smart devices at home and in other environments. So mobile learning is changing. But what we're interested in here are the designs that we can produce and how use of different technologies, perhaps in combination, can help learners to achieve their goals. Now, I'm going to be basing what I'm talking about here on our latest Innovating Pedagogy report, where we describe this idea of best learning moments. I'm currently the lead author of this series of reports. It started in 2012, and we launched our latest report earlier this year. It's meant for teachers and policymakers and educational designers, support staff and other people. And its focus is on exploring new forms of teaching, learning and assessment. This year, I wrote about best learning moments for this report, and I invite you to have a look at it, download the report and read some more about this innovation and also others. But let's look more closely at what is meant by best learning moments. The idea is based on the psychological concept of cognitive absorption or flow. And what's important here is that we're looking at deep involvement or immersion when the learners are engaged in an activity or a task. That task or activity is typically challenging, but not too challenging. It's appropriate to their skill level. So these can be fleeting moments, so literally moments, or they can be longer periods of time. But what's key to this is that they're often accompanied by feelings of enjoyment. So the learners talk about really being happy in that moment. Often they describe leisure pursuits such as perhaps painting or doing crosswords or playing the piano. But often these are also social occasions where they are with others, playing a game perhaps, or solving a problem, and they feel like this is a really great moment. More broadly, this term can also mean enjoyable learning experiences. So it's not a very precise term, but still, I think it's very useful. A few years ago, Professor Stephen Heppel did some work in this area, and he asked a number of learners to describe their best learning moments. And after they'd done that, he analyzed their responses and came up with this list of top 10 characteristics of best learning moments. Now, in his sample, the learners talked about being active, doing something while they were learning. They often talked about doing it with others. There was a sense of personal progress. So, in other words, the learning really mattered to them. It was a personal experience and they cared about their progress. Typically, some kind of guide, coach, or teacher was involved. So there was somebody that they could turn to, that they could ask questions of, get feedback, and so on. Typically, a difficult task was being achieved, so there was that element of challenge. There was an audience for their work. Someone cared about it. They wanted to read it or see it. Also, they had a sense of, well, I got there early, perhaps earlier than other people or earlier than I thought, and got some results early. So that was a sense of satisfaction. They were also comparing themselves to other learners in that process. They had a feel for how they were doing compared to other learners. And there was some passion involved, either their own passion for the subject, or the teacher was very passionate, or their group was really very enthusiastic about their learning. And finally, last but not least, there was a little eccentricity. Usually that might be an eccentric teacher. That was a memorable teacher, a little bit quirky, but actually in an enjoyable way and something that added to their positive experience. So it's good to bear these 10 characteristics in mind as we strive to develop more best learning moment opportunities for our learners. Now we can ask ourselves how technology enhanced learning can promote best learning moments. And here the literature that we can draw on is from a number of areas, including game-based learning, because in game-based learning, there's a strong emphasis on learner engagement, a sense of challenge and fun. Secondly, immersive virtual environments provide adventure and many experiences that draw on different senses, so to really draw you into the experience. Thirdly, mobile learning and use of social media, which is often described as participatory, a personal experience, and opportunistic, so taking advantage of encounters, chance encounters, ways of using the language, people to interact with. And finally, learning analytics. And in this area, the focus is on data that can be collected about students' engagement with activities, for example, in online platforms. And this data can be used to inform and to improve learning designs for the future. So now we turn to mobile language learning specifically. and the research that we can draw on here. So learners' self-directed language learning on their smartphones is a key theme that I would like to emphasize here. We've done a lot of research in this area over 2 decades now. And what we know is that strong motivation is associated with personal choice on the part of the learners. They choose what to do, whether to listen or to watch or to read, and they immerse themselves in that activity. So that's why here the examples that are published talk about immersion in listening or watching. Quite often activities such as listening to songs and writing down the lyrics, but also personal choices in terms of what to watch and listen. And with the purpose quite often of hearing and understanding different varieties of the language. Often English, because a lot of the work is done on learners of English. The second important strand is where there are evaluations of mobile apps or systems. And in these evaluations, the researchers report what the learners said or felt about their experience, so their perceptions, their experiences. So for example, in an evaluation of a mobile app for vocabulary learning, which is quite a common kind of activity, the learners would be asked about their experience. So this might cover aspects such as the visual appeal of the app or the design of it, for example, gamification features, whether they offered enough challenge and enjoyment. And that would be in addition to assessments around their actual vocabulary learning. So there are different aspects of research that can be brought to bear on this whole idea of how to design better learning moments for the learners. Now I'm going to pause briefly here and give you the opportunity to consider these 3 questions. First of all, the first question, which relates to your students and what you know about your students. So here you could consider what you know as to when and why your students experience their best learning moments in their language learning. Whether you have discussed this with them and whether you could discuss it with them. Second question asks you, how might your learners capture the best learning moments to share with you and with others, perhaps to facilitate that discussion or reflection for themselves on their best learning moments? And thirdly, how do you already, or how could you in future, create the conditions for more best learning moments to occur? Now, moving on to considering learning designs in mobile language learning. Here we can draw on literature that relates to collaborative learning, immersive games, location-based augmented reality, and extensive ebook reading, to give just 4 examples. So in research on collaborative mobile language learning, learners will often report that they enjoyed that experience and really got something out of it. In immersive games, similarly, they report positive experiences. Location-based augmented reality is interesting because it's still an unusual kind of activity, but increasingly, mobile language learning can be designed to be location-based, so specific to a particular location, whether that be a place that people visit or frequent on a regular basis, or even if it's just their home. And the augmented reality aspect that can be added to such location-based experiences with information overlaid on the environment and tasks associated with that. And finally, the extensive ebook reading. Of course, ebooks, well, reading more generally, in fact, has often been described as an immersive experience for those who really enjoy reading. So how can we build on that to provide more extensive reading opportunities and turn them into best learning moments? We would want to do that because of the affective gains, the enjoyment that people have from engaging in such activities. And in terms of language learning, lowering of anxiety often is quoted as being a bonus from such activities. And the learners feeling in control, feeling that they can actually achieve something, they're able to do something, and they have some say over what they're going to do and how they're going to learn it. Secondly, increased use of the target language is often cited in these types of studies about collaborative, immersive, location-based, and more extensive reading and other activities. So use of the target language with different people and in a wider range of contexts. And thirdly, designs in these types of learning are often based on engaging character roles and storytelling. So taking all that together, it's quite a strong argument for looking more closely at these types of learning designs and seeing if we can incorporate them into our teaching and learning. Now, earlier this year, I was happy to be able to announce the publication of a book that I worked on with a colleague in Italy, Valentina Morgana. And we produced this collection of case studies in mobile language learning innovations across different educational contexts. So we looked at what was happening in different contexts at primary school level, secondary, and beyond. So a really interesting opportunity to look at practices and emerging designs across different sectors. And having done that, we were able to look at this whole collection and identify some emerging overall themes. So I wrote a final chapter for this book. And in that chapter, I identified 5 major themes that we should take note of and that should inform also our future designs. So you can see them here on this slide. And if you look on the top left-hand corner of the diagram, there's enjoyment and perception of personal gains. This came through strongly in the case studies, and it links very nicely to the idea of best learning moments, some of the characteristics that I mentioned earlier. Just below that is the multiplicity of technologies, methods, and modalities. Because what came through very strongly also in the case studies was that it wasn't just the use of, for example, smartphones or just tablets, but a whole range of technologies in different contexts. And sometimes more than one technology, method, or modality was being used. And this was a feature of the case studies. Now, if you look in the middle there of that diagram, we have frequent interaction and reflection. Again, a very important feature. Learners really appreciated being able to interact with others, with teachers, with all kinds of different people, in fact, and having opportunities to reflect. And these were elements of the designs that are featured in the case studies. And finally, the 2 remaining themes, unfettered flow of information and breaking down barriers. They're quite related to each other. Unfettered flow of information is thinking about how learners can work across contexts and not have to worry about accessing their resources or people who can help them. So there's a flow of information across devices, across settings. And that links to breaking down barriers. So not putting barriers in the way of being able to access learning environments, but also breaking down barriers between different people and groups of people. So in the case studies in this book, there are examples of where the community was involved, where volunteers were involved, where parents were involved, teachers, learners, and others working together in different settings to enable really effective but also enjoyable learning. Now, as we draw towards the close of this presentation, I wanted to briefly also talk about capturing best learning moments, which was one of the questions I proposed to you earlier. How could you help your learners capture their best learning moments? So here you can consider a range of options, some traditional ways and some more future oriented. So these range from taking photos and making videos, screenshots if appropriate, and also experience sampling. So asking learners at perhaps various points of their day to give an account of their experience, perhaps asking them to give a description of a good learning moment or their best learning moment that day. And then conventional approaches such as journals and diaries, which can be done, of course, on paper or in digital form, and focus groups where the learners share their ideas. In terms of future technologies, I think we'll see more use being made of facial analysis and behaviors that are tracked and then interpreted so that we can become more aware of our own experience by having that reflected back to us, and increasing use of sensors on the body, on our clothes, and so on. So I think there will be more opportunities to capture best learning moments as we go forward into the future. But it's something that we can focus on now and do it in very simple ways. So to wrap up this presentation, a few key points to reiterate. We have had a focus in this talk on innovations that bring lasting benefits, because what's important is that learners should develop positive dispositions towards learning and have a sense of personal gains. And these can bring lasting benefits because over the course of a lifetime, if people are engaging in language learning again and again, they need to have that positive attitude and disposition towards it, so that even if they forget one language, they can come back to it later and resume it again. So the second point is about discovering and helping learners to create best learning moments. So how are you going to discover what your learners' best learning moments are? Will you ask them? Will you get them to track these aspects in their lives? And how can you collectively with your learners help to create some of these moments? And finally, to stress that the learning designs we've been discussing are very much aligned with student preferences if we want to promote best learning moments. So we should take note of their preferences. And if they say that what they're looking for is more interaction, more immersion, more collaboration, more multi-sensory experiences, for instance, then we could try and build those in. Of course, preferences are individual, so no two learners are alike. And this approach is very learner-centered and looks to see how, at least some of the time, their preferences can be reflected in the language learning that we offer. So thank you very much for being here in this session. You're welcome to follow me on Twitter or get in touch. And I hope you enjoy the remaining presentations in Insights on Demand. Thank you very much.